Awesome. Jay, you want to start with the introduction while I steal the host back?
Yeah. I'm not sure you're going to be able to do that. I think you might have to have it returned to you. Easy there, Eric.
Oh, sorry.
Jeez.
Those are the patented shorts.
Hey, guys. My name is Jay, and I am one half of Upside, rocking the Upside sweater today. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and previously spent a couple years running a startup company that was based in Cincinnati. It was a digital ticket marketplace. We raised a little bit of money, and then we ultimately sold that company in 2015. Worked there with a company that bought us for a year, then took a product management role at a venture-backed startup here in Columbus, Ohio. And about a year after I took that role, I quit, and I've been doing my own thing for the last 3+ years now as a freelancer and content creator, and Upside is a big part of that.
And my name is Eric Hornung. I work in finance, so my story is a little bit shorter than Jay's. I worked in finance in Chicago and then New York, and then moved back to Cincinnati, where I work in investment banking and private equity. I do Upside on the side, but it's like one of those full-time, part-time things, you know? Anyway, today's presentation is going to be a few frameworks for thinking about startup communities in the Midwest, and it comes from the perspective of Jay and I doing over 150 interviews with founders, funders, and community builders from over 60 different cities across the country. So we're going to try to tailor it to the Midwest, but there's some themes that leak in from other places. So to understand the Midwest, I think from a startup community perspective, I think first you have to understand Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley goes back a long ways, and I think a lot of people think about the tech boom in the 90s, but really it started in 1957 with the Fairchild Semiconductor and the saga that is the Traitorous Eight. In the 60s and 70s, that community started building up, and 8 people who left Fairchild Semiconductor went on to start a lot of the big names that you know in Silicon Valley that make chips, but also Kleiner Perkins, which is one of the oldest venture capital firms, Xerox PARC, which there's endless stories there. In the 80s, you saw hardware and the personal computer revolution come along. The 90s, the dot-com boom, and then in the 2000s, you had the first kind of outside of Silicon Valley experiment happen, where a lot of these cities said, "Oh, they're doing this, we can do it too." And they started funding nonprofits to start startup communities outside of Silicon Valley in their own city to have some of the success that Silicon Valley was having. Now, 2009 hit, a lot of that folded. The funding went away, and you guys might not be old enough to remember. I'm barely old enough to remember 2009, but I was graduating high school, and it was a large financial recession that really just like reset the clock on a lot of those projects. 2010s, this all came back, and it's been building up for the last 10 years, and we have kind of our second leg of the movement here. So what is the Silicon Valley playbook? You fund local companies until you get a unicorn, which means you're shooting for billion-dollar companies. That unicorn reaches liquidity. When it does that, that means it IPOs or someone purchases it, and the first couple hundred employees make a ton of money. They go on to start their own things or their own funds, and they either invest in or are invested in by investors who just made a lot of money, and the flywheel gets turning faster and faster. This is the playbook in a nutshell. The majority of the Midwest and the rest of the country is at that first stage. They're still trying to figure out how to build that first unicorn. There are some cities that are in that phase 3, phase 2, like a Chicago or an Austin or a Seattle, but very few are in that the flywheel is spinning all out. And those are really Boston or the general Massachusetts area, New York, and Silicon Valley. So there are 3 takeaways I want you to have from this presentation. The first one is that the Midwest is a generalized term for a collection of over 60 cities and geographies spanning 15 states, and even that is a rough definition. All cities come with a superficial stigma or a reputation or something that you kind of know about them inherently from just being on the outside. But that's usually not, especially for journalists, that's usually not the most interesting story that's happening in that city. So I would just advise you to always seek the unreported story. The world doesn't need another Kansas City has good barbecue story, right? There's something more there. And then the best way to learn about a startup community is simply to have nuanced conversations with, we're talking about startups here, so individuals building the companies in that city. All right, now for a little activity. So if everyone has their chat open, start typing out some names of states that you believe belong in the Midwest. Ohio, all right, there you go, that's an easy one. Michigan, Wyoming, controversial, Indiana, Minnesota, Kentucky, Illinois. All right, so right away, Wisconsin, Iowa, right away we come up to the first debate, which is that regions in the United States are tricky. If we look at the technical definition of the Midwest, it looks like this. So whoever said Wyoming or Tornado Alley, which I'm guessing is Oklahoma or Kentucky, technically you'd be wrong, but that's not the problem here. The problem is that there is a loose definition of what the Midwest is. In fact, some people who live in the Midwest think the Midwest is actually too big of a space in of itself, and it should be narrowed down to two parts, the upper Midwest and lower Midwest. And there's no definition on that either. The upper Midwest is really the Great Plains, whereas the lower Midwest is related to the Great Lakes. Now you can make the case that St. Louis, which is in the upper Midwest on this chart, is actually part of the lower Midwest based on culture and geography and all kinds of stuff. And people try to make all the regions of the United States seamless along state borders. It never works. Great Lakes State pump up. There we go. The regions look so simple on this graph, right? You know, okay, if I'm in Pennsylvania, I'm in the Northeast. But Pittsburgh is actually much more of a Midwestern city than it is a Northeastern city. Or someone said Kentucky earlier. I personally believe that Louisville feels more like a Midwestern city than it does a Southern city. So what's it actually look like? I already said regions are very messy. They're based on culture, geography, and a lot of it is based on history. Here's my high-level take of what the United States looks like from a region perspective. It's not clear. It's not easy. And Jay and I have done, like I said, over 150 interviews together, and I think he would disagree with probably some of these concentric circles.
I disagree with a lot of things.
See, there you go. So you actually have like sub regions within regions. You have the larger regions. You see that the Southeast has all kinds of, Rhode Island is an autonomous zone. I guess I missed Rhode Island. Whoops. So there is a lot of just differences in how people define regionality based on where they're from and what they know. So I think when it comes to startup communities, using regions is a poor stereotype and a lazy proxy that a lot of people who write in national publications tend to do. So you'll see Midwest companies are on the rise. And it's like, all right, well, we just saw that Midwest is not just Midwest, right? Like, don't generalize everything together when it's such a large segment of the population. So instead, we should focus on cities. Okay, another activity. We're gonna do some word association with a few cities to see what you guys, but just the first thing that comes to your head when you see Cincinnati, Ohio. Bengals, pork, wow, Porkopolis, nice. Baseball, Skyline Chili, Clifton, PNG, home, all right. Pride, my uncle, University, Rhinegeist, or the Rhine, the Cleveland Clinic. All right, how about Chicago, Illinois? Bean, Bears, Windy City bowls, more bean, a lot of bean. Wow, a lot of bean. Deep dish pizza, Windy, hot dogs. All right. Childhood home. How about Madison, Wisconsin? Cheese, cold, cold, nothing. Scott Resnick. All right. That's a deep cut, Jay. Cold, cheese, pretty much cold and cheese in Madison, Wisconsin. And this, if that was Madison, Wisconsin, let's see what Columbia, Missouri is. Where? Huh? Who? Nowhere? Huh? Yeah, we got a lot of. So Columbia is actually a fantastic little town that has 2 unicorns in it. It's it's a fascinating place. We won't go too much in it. And then the last one is Indianapolis, Indiana.
What are those unicorns? Zapier?
Zapier would be a unicorn, but the other one is a construction company. They rate the 2.6 billion valuation, I think. We got a lot of NASCAR, Children's Museum. Unicorn is a $1 billion valuation company. So in venture capital, the goal is to exit for $1 billion or more. And when venture capitalists are looking to invest in a company, they ask a simple question: will this company be worth $1 billion when it exits? That's the basis. All right. So as you can see, each of those cities has their own kind of what you know about them. And Columbia is the same, right? A lot of people didn't know about Columbia. Exiting. Great questions. Exiting is when either a company buys you or you go public on a stock exchange. So when Google, it's called an IPO, an initial public offering. When they went public on the NASDAQ, which is a stock exchange in New York, they received, all of their employees had stock in the company, and they were able to sell that on a public exchange to other people, which is called a liquidity event. It's when they get liquid cash. The other way that you exit is when, like Waze, which is a driving app, they sold their company to Google for $3 billion. So those are the 2 ways that you can exit in a positive light. The other way you can exit, which is not the right way to go, is bankruptcy, which is a liquidation at essentially 0 valuation. Okay, so each of those cities and every large city in the United States has a startup community now. And there's kind of 2 leading insights into how to launch a startup community. The first one is Brad Feld's Startup Communities, which puts the entrepreneur first and only. The second one is The Rainforest, which is by Victor Huang of the Kauffman Foundation. And he says, actually, there's a lot more players, and everyone needs to know their roles in the community for it to function properly, kind of like a rainforest. So when you think about a startup community, regardless of which theory you think is right, there are a lot of players in a startup community. All of it has to be centered around the founder because they are the ones who are launching the startups. They are the ones who are creating the startups. But you also have community builders and support services, which help the startups to grow, to learn, to pitch, whatever they need from a resource perspective that isn't investment. You have investors and customers, which either give you money to find customers or give you money as customers. You have vendors and professionals, which founders give money to. So those can be lawyers, they can be commercial landlords, anyone who is helping companies for a fee. And then the last one is government and legacy big cos who kind of have created that community already. So if we think Cincinnati, you have the government there, the local government, but you also have Procter & Gamble and Kroger and Fifth Third, who all contribute to the startup community. Now, this is important when you're a journalist. You need to understand how centralized this startup community actually is, or how grassroots it is. So something that is very grassroots, that is all founder-based, That means there's only founders, there's very little community builders, very little venture capitalists, very little government involvement. That's going to look like one type of community, whereas a centralized community is going to look a lot different. So the questions that I would ask to figure out whether or not something was grassroots or centralized, I would say, where do the funds come from? Who organizes the events? When you're talking to entrepreneurs, are people always referencing one organization? That's sometimes referred to as a gatekeeper for startups. And then another question is just how much of the economic development budget is allotted to high scale businesses or high growth businesses like startups? This is just a super simple depiction of the amount of money that's given to startup funding in any city. So in a city or state, you're going to see the majority of expenses are not related to economic development. They're education, public assistance, medical or Medicaid or healthcare, corrections or prisons, transportation, and then there's kind of this everything else bucket. And within that everything else bucket is economic development. Within economic development, there's three main buckets. The first one is incentives for large corporations to either move to the city or not move out of the city or state. The second one is resources for small businesses that are not high scale. So think about your local restaurants or your local grocery store or your mom and pop hardware store, making sure that they have the resources to get up to speed and stay up to speed and take advantage. And then the final one, which is often the smallest budget, is the startup funding bucket. And that difference that we saw on that last slide between grassroots and centralized is the difference between a very small amount and a pretty small amount. So when we get back to it, the question is, what's better, centralized or grassroots? And to be honest, there is no answer. There is no right answer. Every community is different, but I will say in the Midwest, you tend to see more of a centralized model than a non-centralized model. So I'm going to throw a couple depictions up here to show you guys kind of just visually this would be a very grassroots community where you see very little of the blue per founder. This would be like a very centralized community where there are a ton of community builders and a ton of investors and customers and everything is very big and you don't have a lot of founders. So in this case, you'd want to increase your density of founders. This is actually a lot what like Cincinnati looks like. So Cincinnati has a large network of community builders and support services. They have organizations that are state funded called Centrifuge and Cincy Tech. But there's not a lot of investors in the city. The government's behind them and there's a ton of vendors. And this is something that's more like St. Louis, where it's a financial town that doesn't have a lot of centralized community building or support services, but has a lot of investors and has a lot of professionals who have the knowledge to actually help. Okay, so when you take a step back, there's going to be a lot of rankings about communities. So you can always type in what's the best company or what's the best city to start a company in. And then you can kind of work your way through those rankings. And they're going to try to see a lot of the same traits that we talked about here. They want to see startup activity, which is the investors dot. They want to see access to resources, which is the community builders dot. They want to see business climate, which is going to be both the government and the vendors dots. But none of them are right. And that's the important thing to know about these rankings, because this one from Midwest Startups is good, but there's another one from Inc. that says the best place to start a business. There's another one from Fortune that says the best place to live if you're a millennial starting a business. There's another one and the list goes on, and none of them are right. And that's important to know because it's all about having conversations. So my last 2 points are we talked a lot about venture capital here because that's one type of entrepreneurship that gets a ton of attention, but there's a lot of entrepreneurs in these communities that are just not building venture capital. We talked about unicorns. They're not building unicorns. They might be building a company that's going to do $1 million of profit a year, and it's going to be a great company, but they're not building billion-dollar companies, and that's okay. But those people are important too in those communities. And the only way to learn what is happening within a community is to have conversations, because all of the media and all of the news and all the things you can read and research, they all have incentives behind them and people behind them that are pushing that message. And it's your job as journalists to not accept the message at face value, but to have deep, nuanced conversations to find the real message.
Not to mention, a lot of times, sorry, can I add on there, Eric?
Yeah, I was just going to wrap up. So
a lot of times, even in a city where they don't get a ton of media coverage, there's this phenomenon where it's like more speaking will lead to more speaking. So if you hear this narrative about a certain company or a certain organization over and over again as it relates to a city, it's because people are being lazy and not digging in deeper to find alternatives to talk to. And they just kind of go to their memory bank to think, okay, who do we associate with this city or with this idea, and just going with the easy route. And usually there's a lot more underneath the surface that's worth exploring.
All right. Happy to take a couple questions now. Maybe we'll do a question or two if you guys have one. We can either do it via the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask. And
just based off the last point that Jay was talking about, so what are ways to promote kind of new conversations instead of just taking, and what does it look like to take the easy way by just like going back to the memory? I guess, can you give more examples of what that means?
Yeah. So in Cincinnati, for instance, there is a company called Lisner, and from what I've heard, they're a great company. I don't really know much about them, so I'm not talking to them specifically from a quality perspective, but from a every single time that Cincinnati is mentioned in the national media or in the local media, or they put out a year in review for Cincinnati, Lisner is on the front page. They're the main story, and you're kind of hearing their story again through their eyes with the regurgitated sound bites that sound good, that are in line with the message of Cincinnati being a great place to start a business because you get support services from Centrifuge and Cincy Tech, and they got connected to a big co-customer through their investments that way. So there's this kind of repeating cadence with that one company. This is one specific instance. This happens in every single community, where they kind of get held up as almost a publicity stunt's too strong of a word, but that's an example. Jay, do you have something else?
Yeah, and just to say, meanwhile, if you talk to other founders who are on the grassroots end of the spectrum in Cincinnati, they'll tell you, don't worry, don't think too much about Listener. This company over here is doing something really interesting. You should talk with them. And it's really not that difficult to dig deeper. You just need to find somebody who's already keyed into the ecosystem, and they generally know, what is most timely and interesting. When Eric and I find new guests for the podcast, most of the time it comes from other guests that we're talking to. We say, who else should we be talking to in this area? And they'll say, oh, you got to talk to this company because they're about to raise a Series A. There aren't headlines saying this company is about to raise a Series A. That's not something that you can Google for and find, because that's not public knowledge. But it does travel. Yeah. But it does travel, by word of mouth through people who are already plugged into that local ecosystem, and they can help you wayfind to those stories if you just ask.
I have a quick question. Oh, sorry. Did I interrupt someone?
Keith just asked local poster child in quotes. Keith, can you expand on that? Sorry to cut you off.
That just seemed less severe than publicity stunt, right? So
Yes.
A nicer way to say, right? This is sort of like everybody, the powers that be agree that we're going to hold up Listener as our representative, because like you said, like we're too lazy to tell 5 little stories. We're just going to keep telling one story over and over again.
Yeah, that's a much better word. Thank you. Sorry, who's going to ask a question?
Yeah, me. So my question is, in your opinion, what are the best possible ways for startups to deal with the aftermath of COVID, nationwide as well as in this region of Midwest?
I'm not even sure it's the aftermath they need to deal with. I think it's the immediate reality. A lot of startups, are really operating on small budgets and short time horizons. So it really comes down to what is their biggest challenge with COVID. Most likely, they're struggling with, well, people aren't buying right now, depending on their market, or they might be struggling with, well, we're having a harder time fundraising because of this uncertainty. People don't want to invest. So, it's something Eric and I see right now is investors are, good news is, more likely to take more Zoom meetings from startups across the country than they were before. So there's more opportunity to meet investors right now if you get on top of that. But the downside is they're also more likely to deploy more of their funds to safer bets that have a little bit more traction and numbers to them. So early stage startups might be running into a little bit of trouble. I would say probably the most immediate thing they could do is find out where they can cut costs. And for companies that are already running lean in the middle of the country, they already do a pretty good job of that. But if there's ways to even lean down further to extend your runway, I think that would be a good place to start. Eric, what do you think?
To Jay's point, I think it really depends on in the startup space, the way that money is raised is through a convoluted thing called rounds. And it starts with pre-seed and then goes seed and then goes Series A. And Series A is your first real institutional round. There might be institutional people in your seed round, but for the purpose of this, that's irrelevant. After your Series A, you go Series B, C, D. When you go Series B, C, D, you're actually raising for excessive amounts of growth. You're not raising to find product market fit anymore. You're not raising to make sure that your product serves a customer. You're not raising to validate an idea. So once you kind of take that Series A or B money, I think those startups are actually in a tougher place because they've been, to Jay's point, adding costs, which is usually employees, to their expense structure at a very rapid rate. Like we have a friend who was on the podcast who went from, I think, 10 to 75 employees in the course of a year. And it's hard to build yourself for growth and then stop the momentum immediately. So I think the companies that are before a Series A, the companies that are that have raised $1 million to $3 million in a seed round, who have 8 employees, are probably better off in the near term than the companies that are maybe at a Series B and they've just raised $55 million 2 years ago, and now they need to go back to the well. Yeah, that's my take. One last question, then we'll push on to Jay's, and then we can do questions afterwards. Have you found any correlation with the founder centralized spectrum in relation with city size or with any other variable of Midwest cities? I would say not in regards to city size, because I think it has more to do with state funding and state matching than it does with city size.
I had the same thought.
Yeah, I think in Ohio, there was just so much money that was given out through the Third Frontier that had this earmark that there was a local nonprofit in each city that kind of oversaw the program, that each one of those, each city in Ohio became more centralized than less.
Same thing happened in Pennsylvania.
Same thing happened in Pennsylvania, whereas I think Chicago, they didn't really put any money behind it. They tried to do 1871, which is a co-working spot, but I guess Chicago is a larger city too. Milwaukee is very decentralized, and that's about the same size as Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. Indianapolis is only centralized because they have one large investor, but I would consider them more on the decentralized side. So no, nothing between city size. Yeah. Perfect. All right. Jay, you want to take off and show us how to create a podcast to have these conversations?
Let's do it. Who here, if you have considered starting a podcast, put something in the chat. Say I have or yes or something like that while I start sharing my screen. Nice. I see 3 yeses. That's more than 2, less than 4. There's 4th. There's a 5th, kind of. Are you seeing regular green screen here, Eric, and not presenter view?
I am seeing presenter view.
Okay, let's swap it on back then. Awesome. Cool. So, YARP. I love YARPs. So let's talk about podcasting and why you would want to start a podcast. For one, it's one of the best networking hacks that I've ever found by a long shot. This is a perk that Eric and I expected when we started the show, but probably still underestimated. We've talked to a couple hundred pretty difficult to access people on Upside, and on the other podcast that I run, Creative Elements, I've talked to Seth Godin, who's like a personal hero of mine. It just seems like it's a really great excuse to reach out to somebody that you respect with a very low ask, just a few minutes of their time for something that hopefully they'll enjoy and also be glad that they did. It also forces you to be a better speaker. And as journalists, I would expand this to say it forces you to be a better question asker. Because really, when you put the constraint on your time, which is how long you'll be talking to somebody, it forces you to prioritize what information you want to get and ask good questions. And as you kind of go up the scale towards talking to people that do a lot of interviews already, it makes you want to ask unique questions too. So to me, I actually think of podcasting as kind of a modern day Toastmasters, except for maybe even better, because you can interview anybody you want. You can talk to anybody you want on your podcast. You're not going to get Seth Godin in your Toastmasters group locally. You can edit the podcast. So before you actually share it, you can make it something that you're proud of. You can listen to the recordings of your own questions and how it all came out so that you can be happy with it. And you can get a lot of reps really, really quickly by doing a podcast. It helps you create a habit of publishing, because if you go out and you say publicly, I'm going to release an episode of this every week or every 2 weeks, that's kind of a forcing function to get you to do that fear of public accountability. And anything that you create is sort of like making your own lottery ticket. This is a little bit of a stretch, but so is winning the lottery. You know, anything that you create, it may not take today or tomorrow or next week, but it could be months, years down the line, and some interview that you did in the form of a podcast gets a lot of attention because of some insight that was shared there. You just don't know. And it's evergreen, it's long lasting, it's something that can be really valuable. And of course, if it goes really well, like our friend Joe, who started on Fear Factor of all places, it can go really, really well. He just signed I forget if it's $150 or $250 million contract.
100 a year.
Crazy. Over $100 million a year to do his podcast on Spotify. He has 11 times as many listeners as Howard Stern. And at his own estimations of 200 downloads per month, if he was selling ads for an $18 CPM, that means before the Spotify deal, he was doing somewhere between $64 and $240 million of revenue per year, which is crazy. And again, is pretty a lot more compelling than what Howard Stern is doing on Sirius. Let me fast forward here. Here's some graphs that are pretty that say a lot of people listen to podcasts. There's a lot of potential in starting a podcast, but it's not a get rich quick scheme by any means, because there are over 1 million active podcasts right now with, I think, something like 74 million episodes that exist. So if you're going to do it, you need to stand out and do something unique. And so in the beginning, I would ask yourself some questions to give yourself a shot at doing something unique. First one being, what's the point? What is your goal for doing a podcast? Who is that show for? What does it do for them? How is it doing something for them that isn't already being done elsewhere? Is this a show that's educational or entertaining? You want it to be a little entertaining, but I would honestly tell you that you should really go for educational because that's going to be easier to compete long-term, in my opinion. A lot of entertainers, people like Dax Shepard or Anna Faris, they come in, they have a lot of experience being entertaining, they have built-in name recognition, they're going to steal airtime away from the indie entertainers over and over again. Next, once you know kind of the point of the show, what is the format of the show? How are you actually going to structure your episodes? Will you have a co-host like Eric? Will you interview guests? Will you have any specific segments, things that you do every show just because you think it's fun and it's something that people can count on? What is your target episode length? How long should they be? The average commute in the United States pre-COVID, when we still had commutes, was 26.6 minutes. So it's good to shoot for about 26.6 minutes. That's also a little bit less than the median listening time to date. How often will you publish new episodes? I also want to point out that I think shorter podcasts are easier to get an audience in right now. When you're just getting started, I think of listening as mostly a zero-sum game unless you are getting someone to listen to podcasts for the first time. In most cases, people who are podcast listeners already are most likely to listen to your show, but they probably have podcasting built into their routine, whether it's commute or working out or running or doing dishes. They have a set number of hours per week they're already listening to podcasts. And so if you want them to prioritize some time for you, you're either going to have to take that away from some other show, or you're going to have to be short enough that it's worth them checking it out and trying to slip it in. Let's talk about interviewing guests for your podcast. The quality of your guests largely determines the quality of your show. They're going to be talking for the majority of your show. So if that is not engaging, that episode's not going to be engaging. So you need to think about that when you are planning who you're bringing on as a guest. Do they have a strong understanding of the topic? Are they able to articulate that perspective well? Are they easy to listen to? If they have a lot of ums and ahs and filler words, and you're not planning to edit that out, if they're not a clear speaker, that's going to be difficult for people to get through and listen to. And also, does this guest already have name recognition within my audience? Do they have the ability to bring their audience to my show? If you want to grow your show, that's an important consideration to make. Feel free to enter any questions in the chat, by the way. I have it up so I can see it, but I have a lot of slides, so I'm just trying to fly through. When you want to book guests, I recommend from the beginning, aiming high. Try to get somebody that seems out of reach, because once you've started putting guests into your feed, when you ask future guests to come on the show, they're going to look at the feed and try to judge for themselves, is this something that someone like me does? And the more inaccessible your guests are, the more you send the signal of, okay, this must be safe and a smart decision for me to go on this show too. Try and find an introduction to those people whenever possible. It's just a lot easier to get a yes if you're referred by somebody else than if you go cold. I think that's true of anything that you're asking for, ever. Let them know why you're reaching out. Give them a short pitch of the show. Let them know how much time that you need from them and what they do what they need to prepare. I try to say, try to keep it under an hour. If you can make the ask 30 minutes or even 45 minutes, then that's a pretty easy ask. And this is really, really important. Give them a generous window for when you can do the recording. When you reach out to a busy person and you ask, hey, can I have 30 minutes of your time? A lot of times they actually want to give you time. But if then you say, let me know a time in the next week that's good for you, they're already booked out this week. They're booked out next week, probably. So give them a few weeks, give them even a couple months. Say, if this is interesting to you, let me know a time in the next couple of months that we can connect. Because if they want to talk with you, but you give them such a short window that they can't accommodate, now they're going to feel like a jerk and they're going to be mad at you, and it's just not going to be a good time. When you get ready to do the interview, do your homework. I recommend listening to other interviews. If your guest has done any other interviews, listening to other podcast interviews with them is some of the best research you can do, because you can find some of the stories that you want to pull insight from and kind of duplicate, but also you can start to avoid a lot of the common questions they get asked all the time, especially if you want them to ultimately share this episode. It needs to be something that they're excited to share, and they're only going to share something that feels unique and different and rewarding to them. Let the guest know what to expect before you hit record. It takes 5 to 10 minutes at least for someone to warm up to you in conversation, just generally. So if you can do that before you start hitting record, Eric and I were on an interview today. Before any interview we do, I give the same spiel to the guest, which is, we're going to talk for 30 to 45 minutes. We're going to start with your background. And I tell them, when I hit record, I'm going to say, welcome to the show. You can respond however you like. Eric will jump in our first question. We have full post-production. So if you want to start over or restate something, you can do that. Like, I have the same spiel that I do before every episode, every recording. And it just starts to build a little bit of rapport with the guest before you start asking them intense questions on the record.
My thing is always to ask them something about the city that they live in, or get them to promise me that they'll take me fly fishing if they live in Montana, like the guy today.
Yeah, Eric did secure a fly fishing trip in Montana today.
Yeah,
in Bozeman. So, which was extended to me because I said so.
Barely.
When you do good research, it lets you ask thoughtful, unique questions. Don't ask closed-ended questions. Always ask open-ended questions. If they can answer your question in a yes, no, it's not a good question. So ask something thoughtful, ask something unique, ask something that leads to them expanding on the question, so that some guests are so good at answering questions that not only will they answer your question, they'll answer the question that you should have asked. And that only happens if you give them an open-ended question in the first place. I also like to build an intensity arc to these questions, which is basically to say, you don't want to go into an interview and ask really intense, deep, or personal questions off the bat, because that'll not lead to a comfortable conversation, but you can kind of build up to it. In the middle of the interview is where you should be asking and have earned the right to ask deeper, more intense questions. And then you never want to end on that either. You always want to leave on kind of a soft, comfortable note. If you're going to do a 30-minute show, don't do a 60-minute interview. It's going to be really hard for you to edit down that interview in post-production. When you constrain your window for the actual length of the show, it forces you to ask better, more thoughtful questions. I like to prepare questions, but to follow conversation more. What I find is, even if I do prepare questions, just the act of having them in my mind at one point, they will come out in conversation when the time is appropriate. Don't try to just go question to question to question in these interviews, because it feels unnatural and disjointed. Kind of know where you're starting, know what the theme of the conversation is, like what is the overall goal and message you want to get for this conversation, and then kind of run from the starting point. Ask for introductions again. Often, some of the best conversation you have is after the interview, when they feel really, really comfortable with you, because it's been 30 or 60 minutes talking with you. When you stop recording, sometimes they'll share some insight with you that you probably wouldn't have gotten on the record, but now they feel comfortable enough with you that they'll tell you. And so that's some of the most fun that we have on Upside. But generally, I would say make it a goal to be a memorable interviewer, because those people will probably be who will give you introductions to other people in the ecosystem or that you want to talk to, but you have to make a good impression on the person you just talked about. I have a little bit about gear here. Do you guys want to hear that, or you want me to skip over it? Yes or no in the chat? Yes. Okay. Run it. So for in-person recording, Eric and I use a Zoom H6 handy recorder, which is pictured here. We use 4 Shure SM58 microphones with table stands. It needs SD cards and AA batteries. Beautiful, beautiful system. This whole thing will run you about $700 to $750 if you get all the things I just mentioned, but it's awesome. It sounds really, really great. Here's a picture of Eric and I at South by Southwest last year using it. It's very compact. It fits into a backpack very nicely. That's the perfect setup for in-person interviews. If you're going to do remote recording, like Eric and I do, you can use really any USB microphone. Pictured here is the USB or the Yeti blue microphone USB that Eric and I both have in front of us right now. I just upgraded to a Rode Podcaster microphone. I would start with something that's a USB mic that you can plug directly into your computer and not go super, super heavy, even though I will show you that heavy option here in a second. We also use Squadcast for remote recording. Zoom like this works just as well. Squadcast is a similar interface, but you don't need an account. You don't need to download anything. And it records all the participants' audio locally and will deliver the full WAV file to the host. Zoom can record locally also, but it will not give you the full WAV files of those recordings. So it's not quite as good. Zencastr is similar. Does Squadcast have its logo on the bottom right? No, it does not. There's no logo at all. However, there is also no video capability. You have a video feed, but it does not record video for you at this time. Zencastr does not have a video feed yet, but they just announced a beta of recording 720p HD video. So that could be a good option soon. And if you really want to go hardcore, you can get the Shure SM7B, which also needs a some sort of input device like a Focusrite Scarlett 8i6 and a cloud lifter. Like there's a whole suite of stuff. You see this mic on big time shows. It's like the best thing you can get. But the whole setup is ridiculous and kind of heavy duty. You can't just plug it into your computer and it's going to run you like $1,200. So I wouldn't mess with it. Here's the setup where I'm sitting right now with my morning coffee. We have a boom arm. We have this shock mount that Eric bought me, and it all just sits here like this. Whew, okay. Last part of this that I want to run through is the actual workflow that I go through on Creative Elements, which is a little bit higher production than Upside, but all the Upside workflow is kind of within this. Step one is identifying guests. We use Airtable as a database of our potential guests. It also shows us the published dates that we have for each episode. And I can manage the entire production process, production workflow within Airtable. Here is what my planning document for Creative Elements looks like. I have it grouped by stage of the process, but Airtable's great. It's a great way to manage the whole process. Then I reach out to guests. I look at my actual like Kanban view of the guests that I have in flight. I have target guests, people I've sent a pitch to, interviews that are scheduled, interview recorded, scripting, in editing, final review, scheduled and published. Like there's a whole workflow there so that I can manage multiple interviews in different stages all at once. When I reach out to the guests, I ask them to schedule on Calendly. I create some windows of time where I have it possible to interview with me. They just pick a time that's good for them, and it sends them a calendar invite directly to their calendar that has the Squadcast link and any information they need to know about recording with me. Then I prepare for the interview by just filling out a simple template in Evernote. I like to get some links for that person, the date of the interview, their name, their bio, any facts that I have. And every episode of this show, I think ahead of time what the goal of that episode is, so that I can guide my questions towards that goal. Anytime you're reaching out to a guest, you already have some reason why you're reaching out to them. So just make it explicit, like, why do I want to talk to this person in the first place? And make that the overall arching theme or goal of the interview. That can drive your questions and make it a lot easier for you to prepare. So this is kind of what this whole thing looks like filled out. I interview in Squadcast, save the files to Dropbox. Then my audio engineer will do a mix of the episode. For Upside, he does everything. Eric and I will record our intro and outro separately. We'll put that in the same Dropbox folder, and our audio engineer just stitches it all together and we're ready to go. But for Creative Elements, there's an element of scripting and a lot more post-production on it. So that engineer will mix together the interview. I'll put the transcript into a tool called Otter, which is free, Otter.ai. It automatically transcribes, for the most part, the whole interview. Looks like this. You can tag the speakers, and it will match that voice by that speaker name. Really, really great transcript tool. So I'll take that script and I will edit the interview to cut out things that I don't want to have in the final copy. Sometimes I move questions around. I also put in some voiceover in there. So I will edit the episode and record the voiceover in GarageBand. This is what that file will look like with me in there, adding voiceover and just moving stuff around. Otter.ai is free, Jesse. It's awesome. There's a paid version that we use because we go beyond the amount of time that we're allotted, but there is a free version and it's great. This is what a script looks like for me. I record it, I send it to my audio engineer. He sends the final file back to me for review and edits. That's the same with Upside. We upload it to the host. The host is this piece of software that you put in the title, the episode description, the audio file, the show art. This is what you actually see when you play an episode on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. All that information is what you put into the host. Then I get a totally cleaned up version of the transcript done in Otter with help from a VA that I found on Upwork. I'll build the webpage for each episode that has the recording of the show, plus some show notes and a transcript and links. For marketing the show, we build audiograms. I use a tool called Wave that creates these square images that have whatever image that you want, but it has kind of a waveform moving thing so people know that it's a video. And you can listen to a short snippet of the show. You can put subtitles on there. It's really, really great. That's actually playing, which is annoying. Sorry if you heard that. Final thing to do is publish. It goes into all the players from the host automatically, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all of it. Then I email the guest, say your episode is live. I give them some links to their episode page. We also link to the tweet that we shared, the Instagram post that we shared. So if they are inclined to share, but they're a little lazy, they can just retweet or do that. Sometimes I even create those audiograms ahead of time and send them the audiograms and their cover art to make them more likely to share. Then you got to market the thing yourself on Twitter and Instagram and all these places. And then you start all over again for the next week, which seems like a lot, right? And it is. And you don't have to go into all those steps. Thanks, Ethan. You don't have to go into all those steps if that seems too heavy. You can cut some of them out. You can just record here on Zoom, download the audio, upload it as a podcast. We go further than we probably need to. And I wouldn't do all those steps if I didn't love it. So that's the end of that. Just some takeaways. Podcasting is a great tool for networking and publishing. If you take it seriously, you actually can make some money from it. But that is a lot of work. And that comes from the beginning, thinking about how you're going to craft the show and taking production quality seriously from the beginning. I actually recommend considering bi-weekly shows, so every 2 weeks, or seasonal shows, kind of a short run, because doing a show every week into perpetuity is a lot. It's a huge, huge, huge commitment, and it will burn on you, and it's not by chance that most shows phase out after 7 episodes. Cool. Anybody have any questions? I tried to get in within 6. Boom, nailed it.
Stuck the landing. Happy to answer any questions. I know I ran through that quickly. So if you're thinking about starting a show and you want to simplify that or anything else, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
Sorry if you guys already mentioned it. I think I joined a little bit late, but how did you guys get to do the podcast in the beginning? Like, what was the beginning of the podcast?
We just decided that we wanted to. That's the beautiful thing about podcasting is it's something that you can just choose to do independently and make it happen. It's not all that expensive. I mean, you have the startup costs of whatever equipment you want to go with. But if you want to record remotely, you're talking about the cost of a USB microphone and a Zoom account or a Squadcast account. It's really pretty affordable. So we did some practice interviews. They were bad, but we liked it. So
they were
terrible.
They were terrible. They weren't bad. They were awful.
So we threw those away. And, we asked a friend of ours to create the album art. We asked another friend if we could use some of his music for the intro of the show. Still the same album art, still the same music we use to this day. And, we just started recording. And we've been doing it every week for 2 years now.
Jay and I wanted to learn to think like venture capital investors, early stage company investors. So we figured, hey, if we have a podcast, maybe people will come on it and we can talk to founders and we can talk to VCs and we can talk to community builders and learn from them how this is supposed to be done. It was either that or go get a venture capital job and do that for 2 years. So I like this path better.
Thank you.
So I have a question. How about advertising or sponsors? Good or bad?
Good. Great. Give me more of them.
I think that until you have an audience that's in the top 1% of podcasts, which is 50,000 downloads per episode, you pretty much need to go the advertisement route, because going to a subscription model or anything like that, it just makes for a really hard experience when everyone expects podcasts to be free and you ask them for money.
Yeah. I mean, some shows will run through traditional ad buyers and they'll have a CPM that they want to pay for those impressions. And for most shows, that just doesn't really make sense or make any money. So for us on Upside in the early going, we structured our own contracts and deals with our sponsors that were at a more reasonable CPM and also lined up with the value of what a customer to them was worth. So if you're not at that huge top 1% level, you're probably going to have to do direct sponsor outreach yourself, which is very, very doable.
There's a great website called Podcorn that allows you to bid on fractional advertisements for a company might have $25,000 to spend and you can eat up $200 of it. So you put a proposal out there. They say, yes, here's the script. You're good to go. So that's a good alternative for small podcasts.
We got a question of some of our favorite podcasts that help us be a better podcaster. Great question. I feel like the shows that I've listened to for the longest time are actually getting worse in terms of production quality. I love Tropical MBA. I think that's a really well done show. And I also really like Without Fail from Gimlet, even though it seems like it might not even be coming back anymore. Some of the shows that do incredible production that I listen to are Song Exploder and Dissect is really good.
For me, I would say the ones that are most influential. I think that Patrick O'Shaughnessy from Invest Like the Best asks, it's either him or Shane from Farnham Street. They ask the best questions of any business podcast interviewer. So I think if you're learning how to ask great questions in a business setting or really just in general, they do a really, really good job. Upside was cobbled together based on a lot of the podcasts that I listen to. So Bigger Pockets that taught me how to do segmentation. So making sure, so Jay and I have a nickname kind of segment that we do at the beginning of every show. And that was stolen pretty much directly from Bigger Pockets / Lil Dicky, if you guys listen to that rapper. Yeah, so I think those are a few. I'm going to type those out in the chat so you guys have all of them.
You were talking about how there are sometimes moments for at the end of interviews or after you turn off the recorder that are kind of they're saying things that are particularly interesting or astute or that you might not have gotten if you hadn't built a good connection with them. And I've done like not kind of chatcast style, but like more human interest podcasts, like audio journals and stuff. And I find that as well. And so I tend to kind of feel unable to ever turn off the microphone. Eventually you turn off the microphone, but I wonder how you guys kind of, knowing that you might get something really good at the very end of a conversation, like, do you ever go back and ask people to repeat it? Do you ever think about just keeping on the microphone until you hang up? Like, how do you kind of go about navigating that?
Jay very often says to me, man, I wish I would have kept the microphone running. So I don't know if that answers the question for him.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to do on a recording device in person to keep it running. With Squadcasts, which we use for remote interviews, there's just a big red light as part of the UI that tells the guest when you're recording or not, so you wouldn't be able to like surprise them in that way. But it's probably not a bad idea. Anything that you say after saying we're off the record now, if you want to put it on the record, you got to ask permission. But I don't know. I guess it depends on how hardcore you are in journalism, because Ohio is a one-party state.
It also depends a lot on what is the purpose of this interview? Is it this one interview is going to help you write this one story, or this one interview is going to help you do this one thing? Obviously, it's great to have a little bit of extra content that's like good and engaging. But for us, so much of what we learn off the mics is additive to our combined knowledge that helps us ask better questions on future interviews. So to me, yes, it would be great to have the content, but it's not. I would rather have that piece of knowledge so that I can ask a better question in the future. Yeah.
Also, if this person's going to be going out on a limb and making an introduction for you, you got to protect the relationship. And
podcast horror stories.
Nothing irreparable is coming to mind for me, other than sometimes I'll have the wrong input device selected on Squadcast, and I'll have to re-record all of my questions because the audio is terrible or unusable. I've had some friends who use Zencastr who literally lost entire recordings, which is why I never used Zencastr. Literally, a friend of mine interviewed Tim Urban of Wait But Why and did it on Zencastr and lost all of it.
I hate it. We used to do Skype with this eCam recorder, and sometimes the eCam recorder would act up, and it wouldn't act up for Jay. So his files would be great, and it would have my voice kind of very low in the background. So I'd have to go like re-listen to all my stuff and then sit there in my room for like hours on end, re-listening to my answer or my little segment, and then re-saying it and then saving everything. So you just be there like, haha, yeah, that's funny, Jay. And it's just like saving all those little segments, because that's how I respond to Jay when he says a joke. But yeah, nothing in the horror realm, just in the tedious realm, I think.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I was wondering if you are not, working on a series podcast. So, for example, us at Midstory this summer, do you think there's value in doing just a singular podcast? And when would you choose to do that over other formats?
When you say singular podcast, are you referring to like just doing 10 episodes and calling it good to go?
No, as in like just doing one interview in the form of like one podcast that you're publishing, just a one-time thing.
If that was me, I would think about it from the standpoint of, let me start by saying this. I don't think one piece of audio content that doesn't live on some other greater feed is really worth doing solely as a podcast. However, I think you could do a really effective addition to another piece of media, especially if you have like a written story about something. Maybe try to do that one interview on Zoom where you can record audio and video, and you can embed the video into the piece to go a little bit deeper. And also, if that's something that a lot of you with Midstory this summer are thinking about, make a Midstory internship feed, theme it something, and drop all of those individual episodes into that feed.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. My thought is, like, if you compare it to a blog, you wouldn't make a website just for one blog post, most likely, unless it's like the most, I don't know. I feel like I would agree with Jay there.
Awesome. Well, Eric, you can keep hanging out if you want. I've got to run. Thank you guys for having me and us. And it was great to meet you. And if you want to email me, you can email me at my address below in the chat.
Yeah, I guess if you guys can all hear me, if we could just give Jay and Eric both a virtual round of applause. Appreciate their time and bring their expertise to the table. I think both in the startup arena and really looking at the region as a whole. I think Eric really provided some good context for us to think about innovation, and think Jay on the podcasting end, the technical aspects of interviewing, and I think it will definitely help you guys out on some of your projects. Even if you're not doing a podcast, going out and interviewing, asking those right questions, getting the practice in. I think Jay is completely right with a lot of those techniques. So hopefully you guys took some notes and got some info from this session. And I appreciate both Jay and Eric. Definitely. If you guys have any further questions, I can definitely, you can reach out to me. I could shoot those questions over to Jay and Eric, and I'm sure they can carve out some time to respond to you guys as well. But appreciate all the help, from Jay and Eric. And if we could just give them a virtual round of applause, that would be fantastic.
I love the round of applause on mute. It's great.